All right, let me tell you something. Because what happened on February 21st, 1992, at The Tonight Show, I still think about it like it was yesterday. Now picture this. She walks through the curtain, Elizabeth Taylor, and the second her eyes meet mine, right there across the stage, something in that room just shifts. And I don't mean TV magic or anything like that. I mean the kind of shift where even the air feels like it's paying attention now. We've got 300 people in the audience, and they all stand up at once. Just like that. Applause hits the room like a wave you can't stop. It's loud, it's emotional, it's everything you'd expect when Elizabeth Taylor walks in. But here's the strange part. She's not smiling. And me? I'm standing behind my desk like I've been doing for 30 years, making people feel comfortable, making it all look easy. But I'm frozen. And I'm frozen because something happened backstage just 30 seconds before we went live. Something I was never supposed to hear. Something she had carried for 40 years without saying a word. And tonight, of all nights, on my second to last week hosting this show after 3 decades, she came here to finally say it out loud. Not about her marriages, not about her diamonds, not about Hollywood gossip or scandals or anything like that. No, something much heavier. Something that would make a guy like me, who's done 4,531 shows, do the one thing I've never done in all those years. Break completely, right there, on live television, in front of 40 million people, and not bounce back from it the same way again. Now, before we go any further, let me just do something I usually don't do mid-story. I see a lot of you in the comments saying, I didn't even realize I wasn't subscribed. So if you're enjoying this, just check real quick. It helps more than you think, and it keeps this whole thing going. All right, back to it. So it's February 21st, 1992. NBC Studios, Burbank, California, 4:47 in the afternoon. And up on the 3rd floor, the hallway outside the dressing rooms, it smells like hairspray, fresh flowers, and something else nobody could quite describe. Not fear, exactly, not excitement. Something in between, something heavy, like history sitting in the air, waiting. Because everybody knew it. Johnny Carson only had 13 days left on this show. 13 days, after 30 years, after 4,531 episodes, after more than 23,000 guests, after becoming so big that late-night television and Johnny Carson were basically the same thing in America. And I'm sitting alone in my dressing room, going through my notes. Then I hear a knock. 2 knocks. I don't even need to look up. It's my producer, Fred de Cordova, and let me tell you something about Fred. He only walks in uninvited when something is wrong. She's here, he says. I look down at the card in my hand. It's covered in my handwriting, questions, topics, little notes. Everything I had prepared for Elizabeth Taylor, and believe me, I prepared for this one. 2 weeks of preparation, because she doesn't do interviews like this often. In fact, she barely does interviews at all anymore. This wasn't just a guest, this was an event. She's asking for 5 minutes with you, Fred says, before the show. Alone, no producers. Now, I've been doing this a long time, and I've never, ever had a guest ask for that. Not presidents, not royalty, not legends, nobody. So I just look at him and say, calm as I can, tell her yes. And that right there, that moment, that's where everything changes. Because whatever she told me in those 5 minutes, nobody knows it publicly for years. But when I walk out of that room, everybody backstage sees it immediately. My face is pale. My hands aren't moving right. And that stack of prepared questions, gone, left in the dressing room. I walk out there with nothing, no script, no safety net. Just me. And here's the thing. What she told me in that room wasn't about Hollywood, wasn't about fame, wasn't about any of the things people expect from Elizabeth Taylor. It was personal. And it hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, because suddenly the whole interview wasn't about her anymore. It was about something tied to me, something I didn't even realize I had been carrying. And that's when I realized this wasn't going to be a normal night, not even close. Now, if you want to understand why this matters, you've got to understand who Elizabeth Taylor was to America. She wasn't just a movie star. She was the movie star. 60 years old at that point, 8 marriages, 2 Academy Awards, the most photographed woman on earth for 4 decades straight, those violet eyes everyone talked about, That face photographers said looked impossible. She had been through more than most people could imagine. Cancer, addiction, plane crashes, surgeries. Illness so severe that at one point a priest had given her last rites. She lost people she loved deeply. And still, she kept going. And in her later years, she turned her entire focus toward fighting AIDS at a time when most people in Hollywood wouldn't even say the word out loud. She watched friends disappear. She watched silence do real damage. And she refused to stay silent. But what nobody really knew was that beneath all of that strength, there was a private side. A side that still woke up at night afraid. A side that carried memories she never spoke about. And somewhere deep in her personal Bible, she kept a photograph. A photograph from 1952. A small gathering in a studio commissary in Culver City. 3 young people. 2 already starting to become known. 1 almost nobody had heard of. A young television host from Nebraska. Just arrived in Los Angeles. $50 in his pocket. And a dream so big, people told him to go back home. His name, Johnny Carson. Johnny. And Elizabeth Taylor. She was there that night when something almost ended before it even began. Something neither of us ever talked about again. Until tonight. Because tonight, she didn't come to reminisce. She came to confess. And she came to ask for something she had never asked anyone in her entire life. Forgiveness. The show started at 5:30 p.m. And as usual, everything looked perfect. My monologue landed right. Jokes about politics, a bit about the Grammys. Audience laughing exactly where they're supposed to laugh. Ed McMahon right there beside me, laughing on cue. Doc Severinsen and the band filling every gap like they always do. From the outside, everything looked normal, but it wasn't. Because I kept looking toward the curtain. Not at my cards, not at the audience. At the curtain, like I was waiting for something. I wasn't sure I was ready for. And maybe I wasn't. At 6:04 p.m., Ed leans into the mic. Music shifts. Something big, something dramatic. And he starts listing credits, like he always does when someone important walks out. 2-time Academy Award winner, star of National Velvet, Cleopatra, Butterfield 8, and then finally, one of the most iconic figures in cinema history. He pauses. And please welcome Elizabeth Taylor. The place explodes. Not just applause, something bigger. Like recognition mixed with awe. 300 people standing at once because they know they're seeing something you don't see every day. And then she walks through the curtain, Elizabeth Taylor, and everything changes again. So picture that moment in the studio. Everything has gone completely still. That silence after Elizabeth Taylor says, "That was you, Johnny." It isn't just quiet. It's like the whole room forgot how to breathe. And Johnny Carson is just sitting there, frozen behind his desk, not performing, not reacting, just there. And then slowly, he shakes his head, almost like he can't accept what he just heard. And he says very softly, like he's reaching back into a memory he didn't realize was still alive, "I remember that night. I remember it exactly." And his voice is different now. No jokes, no stage rhythm, no Tonight Show energy. Just a man talking. He tells her he had $40 left back then. $40. That's it. And he had about 3 weeks before starting a local TV job. He was absolutely convinced he was going to ruin. He was sitting there thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe I go back home. Maybe my father in Nebraska was right all along. Just imagine that. Johnny Carson before all of this, sitting with that kind of doubt. And then he looks at Elizabeth and says something that lands heavier than anything in the whole night. Because he says, she came and sat next to him that night. And he was on the edge of giving up. And Elizabeth's eyes fill up instantly. She whispers, "I had no idea. I had no idea you were that close to leaving." And Johnny just nods. And then he says the part that no one expected to ever hear from him on television. He says, "I had my hand on the phone. I was going to call the airline." And that line just breaks something open in the room, because nobody is watching a show anymore. They're witnessing something else entirely. And someone in the audience, barely even audible, says it out loud without meaning to. "You saved each other." And that's when it hits everyone at once. This isn't an interview. This isn't entertainment. This is two people realizing their lives were quietly holding each other up for 40 years without ever knowing it. And Johnny Carson, the most controlled man on television, lowers his head, and he starts to cry. Not a polished moment, not camera-ready emotion. Real, shaking, uncontrollable emotion. His shoulders drop. His hands press flat into the desk like he's trying to stay grounded, and for almost half a minute, he just lets it happen. No jokes, no recovery line, no exit, just honesty. Elizabeth Taylor stands up from her chair, and she walks over to him, slowly, no rush. Like she understands exactly what this moment is. She reaches him and gently places her hand over his, and she says, very softly, "Look at me." He lifts his head, and she says, "We made it, both of us. We made it." And at that moment, the entire studio stands up. Not like applause, not like a show ending, like people reacting to something sacred, something they didn't expect to witness when they turned on the television that night. Johnny just holds her hand. He can't even speak yet. He just nods. And then Elizabeth sits down on the edge of the desk beside him, still holding on to that moment like it matters for more than just tonight. She tells him something quietly, that there were nights in hospitals, dark moments, times when everything felt impossible, and she would remember that line. It is survivable. She says she didn't even fully understand it back then, but she held on to it anyway. And Johnny finally finds his voice again. He says he never knew it meant that much, and she just smiles a little and says, "How could you know? We never talked about it again." And that's what makes it even heavier, because they didn't build it. They didn't plan it. It just happened, and it stayed alive in the background of both their lives for 4 decades. Then Elizabeth turns slightly toward the audience and the camera, and the energy in the room shifts again. Everyone can feel it. This is not over. She says she wants to talk to the people watching, and suddenly it feels like she's not in a studio anymore. It feels like she's speaking into every living room in the country. She says there are millions watching, and a lot of them are sitting alone right now, in the same kind of silence she once sat in, thinking they are the only ones carrying what they carry. And she tells them something very direct. She says they are wrong, because everyone, absolutely everyone, is carrying something heavy. The person next to you, the stranger on a bus, the person sitting quietly in a hospital waiting room, someone laughing at a dinner table, all of them. And she says the smallest moment of honesty, the smallest real connection, can change everything. She says it changed everything for her. And she is only standing there because a nervous young man once said, "It is survivable." And she believed him. Then she looks at Johnny and says he is still here because she stayed long enough to hear it. And the room just absorbs that. No one moves. No one interrupts. Even the production crew has gone completely still. And then Johnny signals slightly to extend the segment, because time doesn't matter anymore. The clock in that studio is gone. He looks at her and says he wants to ask her something he has never asked any guest in 30 years. Not once. He leans in and asks her, "What do you want people to understand about you? Beyond the fame, beyond the films, beyond everything they already think they know." And for a moment, she just sits there, quiet. And when she finally answers, it is not dramatic, it is not glamorous, it is very human. She says, "I need people to know I am not brave." And that line lands harder than anything else, because everyone always called her brave, strong, untouchable, a survivor. And she says she understands why people think that, but she explains that being afraid every single day is still part of her life. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of failing, fear of everything, and it never fully left. But she learned something else. That fear does not have to be the final answer. She repeats what she heard years ago. It is survivable. And she says she is still testing that idea, still living it, still proving it to herself. And Johnny listens like he already understands every word, because he does. And he quietly says he thinks that man might have been right. And Elizabeth smiles a little and says, "He was 20, very nervous, terrible at hiding it. And the audience laughs gently. A real, warm laugh. Not because it's funny in a joke sense, but because it's human. And Johnny adds almost softly, and he had $40. And she confirms it with a nod. $40. That detail somehow makes it even more real. Then the conversation drifts into something lighter for a moment. The tension doesn't disappear, but it softens, because now they are remembering, not performing, just remembering. And everyone in the studio can feel that shift. Then slowly, the segment starts to come to a natural close. Not because it is planned, but because something emotional has completed itself. Johnny stands, Elizabeth stands, and he walks her toward the curtain. No rush, no production energy, just two people moving through a moment that neither of them will ever repeat. At the edge of the stage, they stop. Backstage light is harsher here, different from the glow of the studio, and for a moment they just stand there. Two lives that crossed in one night 40 years ago, now standing face to face again. Johnny thanks her for coming, and she thanks him for that night, and they both understand something unspoken. Neither of them did it for the other, but it mattered anyway. She squeezes his hand, and she tells him, 13 more days, make them count. And then she walks away, and Johnny stands there for a moment, alone at the curtain edge, looking back at the studio. 30 years of his life waiting behind him. And everything has changed. But nothing outside looks different at all. And then he turns and walks back inside. So now we're at that point where everything that just happened in the studio, it doesn't just stay in the studio. It starts spreading. Because that night, when the episode finally airs at 11:30 p.m., something unusual happens right away. The phone lines at NBC don't just light up. They get overwhelmed. Switchboards jam. Operators can't keep up. Calls just keep coming in. And these aren't the usual calls. Not, I like the guest, or good show tonight. These are different. People calling because they don't quite know what they just watched, but they feel it deeply. By morning, every major critic in America is writing about it. But even the critics are kind of struggling to describe it properly, because how do you review something like that? It wasn't just an interview. It wasn't just television. It was something more personal than that. And then something even more important starts happening. Ordinary people start writing in. Not fans, not industry people. Just people, veterans, students, parents, elderly viewers, people who were sitting alone that night and suddenly didn't feel so alone anymore. Because something Elizabeth Taylor said stayed with them. That idea that everyone is carrying something, that the person next to you might be breaking quietly in a way you can't see. And suddenly, a lot of people start thinking about their own lives differently. Their own silence, their own hidden weight. And letters start arriving at NBC. Handwritten letters. Long ones, personal ones. Some people are writing things they've never said out loud before in their lives, because for the first time they saw it reflected back at them on television. And in the middle of all that, there's one letter that stands out. From a woman in Omaha, Nebraska, 72 years old. She writes that she watched television back in 1952, and she remembers hearing a young man from Nebraska say something that stayed with her for decades. That simple idea. It has to be survivable. She says she never knew who said it, until now. And she just writes, "Tell Mr. Carson thank you." And that's it. No drama, no explanation needed, just gratitude. Time passes. Johnny Carson eventually steps away from The Tonight Show in May of 1992, just a few months after that night. And when he does his final episode, he keeps it simple. No long emotional speeches, no big reflection on his career, just gratitude, a few jokes, a goodbye done his way. But behind the scenes, something interesting is known. Because in the months between that February night and his retirement, he only mentions it once, just briefly, to his producer. He says something like, "I spent 30 years thinking I was talking to an audience, but that night, I realized something different." And what he means is this, that the most important conversations aren't actually for the audience. They're between the two people having them. Everyone else is just listening in, and that idea stays with him, even after the cameras stop. Now Elizabeth Taylor continues her work, especially her AIDS advocacy. She keeps fighting for it long after it was unpopular or risky, right up until her passing in 2011. And when her family later goes through her personal belongings, they find something small, a note card. On it, in her handwriting, just a few words. It is survivable. He was right. And that's it. Simple, direct, personal. And Johnny Carson lives out the rest of his life very privately, away from television, away from attention, almost like he stepped out of the spotlight completely on purpose. But there's one quiet detail people who knew him mention. Every year on February 21st, something happens. He makes a phone call, always the same date, and no one ever really knows what they talk about. But it continues, year after year, until his passing in 2005. And when you step back from all of it, the interviews, the fame, the legacy, what people remember most isn't the jokes or the celebrity moments. It's that one night, because that night gets studied now, in film schools, in broadcast journalism classes, not as entertainment, but as something else entirely, a case study in what happens when television stops being performance and becomes truth. Teachers use it to explain what a real conversation looks like. Therapists reference it when talking about emotional honesty. Writers talk about it when they try to explain why certain moments on TV feel bigger than TV itself. But underneath all of that analysis, the core of it is still very simple. A young woman in 1952 sat in a room afraid of what she might do if she stayed alone. A young man with $40 in his pocket was thinking about giving up. And somehow, without planning it, they crossed paths. And years later, they sat across from each other in front of millions of people and realized they had saved each other's lives without even knowing it. That's the part no analysis can really replace. And maybe that's why people still talk about it. Because it's not really about fame. It's about timing and connection and those small moments where someone says something honest enough at exactly the right time that it changes the direction of another person's life. And sometimes they never even know it happened. So when you think back on that night, February 21st, 1992, it wasn't just a television episode. It was two lives quietly confirming that survival is possible, and that sometimes the most ordinary conversation in one moment becomes the reason someone keeps going in another.